Welcome, everyone. We're all here, and we have our guests here. Our guests are joining us on Zoom, and I can see we also have quite a few people joining us from elsewhere. So welcome. This is the first event in a series of events that we're hosting here at the ONA building in Oerlikon in Zurich, which is part of our ETH seminar week, my studio seminar week. I'm Adam Caruso, by the way, and I've organized this week with myself, Emily Aperse, and Barbara Tuller, who teach with me in the studio. And the title of the week is What is Next? What is next in terms of material culture, in terms of politics, in terms of economics. And we've invited a number of speakers to participate, sometimes to give short presentations and to participate in conversations with the students of the studio. I'm just going to, if you look at the Architecture Foundation website, or you look at the blog, which is linked to the Foundation website that we're doing, which is part of our chair website, you can get fuller biographies of all the participants. And we're also going to be posting bibliographical and other reference material as the week goes on. So it's a kind of dynamic platform. And you can also ask questions on the blog, because I'm not sure we'll get to questions in this Zoom session, because there's rather a lot of us who want to ask questions here. So I'm going to go very briefly. We have 4 speakers today. Marlise Blaser, who is owner and director of Elementwerk Istighofen in Zurich, a precast firm who our practice has actually worked on a number of occasions, and someone who really is innovating in terms of the transformation from conventional concrete products through to fiber cement products and into the future, into cement-free concrete products. And Marlise will briefly be presenting the work that she's doing in those areas. We will then have Katharina Lehmann from Lehmann Gruppe, who's a timber construction company that she is the chairman of, and she is in a way doing parallel work within the kind of culture of timber construction, which has always been an important part of Swiss building culture, but really in the last 3 or 4 years, for a number of reasons, has come to the fore and is really challenging concrete as the main way of building in this country. And then we have Summer Islam and Paloma Gormley from Material Culture. Summer and Paloma are both young architects with their own practices in London. I know Summer quite well. I know Paloma only by reputation. I've never actually met her. But they together, because of an interest in developing materials, but materials that are really sustainable and have little or no carbon within them, started this non-profit organization company called Material Culture, which they're working on with Arabs, and they've started to actually complete some projects using materials that come out of this program. So Summer and Paloma will present third. So I'm going to hand over. So there'll be sort of 5 to 7 minute presentations. We'll do one after the other, and then we'll start the discussion. So I'm going to hand over now to Marlise Blaser. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, and nice to meet you. And I would like to introduce my company. We are specialized for concrete elements with steel fiber or glass fiber. And we make only special concrete element, not elements like standard. And sorry, my English is not so good. I have to say it first. And we are very interested to make special elements, not the similar, the easy ones, and that is still for us every day Herausforderung to make new recipes for the concrete, and to have a good quality and a good aesthetic. Then that is what the architects and the builders want. At the moment, we prove to create a new recipe for recycling concrete, because we think, or I think, it's for the future. We have not enough stones to use, and so it should be a good target to have a new recipe, and that is our next, what we have to do. Okay.
Okay, that's very brief, Marlise, but we'll ask questions after. That's great. That's great. So next we have Katharina Lehmann.
I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, we can see it. Yes.
Okay. So I thought I make 8 statements just to launch the discussion, and it's not only about the material, it's also about business models and about what's next, as I was told to speak about. So our company is actually working in the whole value chain of timber. We are running a sawmill, are cutting the logs to boards, are using the rest material for in the power plant also to produce energy, and doing timber constructions out of this beautiful material. Timber constructions came about 2000 already with the idea of a 3D planning, because prefabrication was part of the time then, and there were also new regulations like fire protection, CAD planning, and so on. So since 2000, timber market was growing, and there was also a growing awareness of ecology. I hope you see the slides. Okay, so what we do today is multi-family houses, public buildings, like here, example in Norway, or just facilities for restaurants as well. It's not only the cladding, it's also the structural interpretation. We do industrial buildings, or buildings like Tamedia, which was really important for us because we could show that timber can used in the city, and timber constructions have also the self-consciousness to consist in an urban environment, and to make maybe other expressions or other things possible also in dense cities. Just a view from the inside, maybe you've already seen it. Or a very traditional form of using timber is still extension, renovation, and so on. One extreme I'm going to talk about later is the modular buildings, because this is what can be the most automized industrialized process in building. And the other extreme are free forms, and both processes I'm going to talk about. But first, let me, because you started with the topic material. So using timber means not only using it as a building material, it also has a lot of impact of other things, like to store carbon, to remove carbon from the atmosphere, but also maybe substitutions for other products which still are used, and where timber could make a huge difference. Also using the fibers, using the printable material, and it's just a sustainable form of substitution. And that's my first statement. The potential is far to be exhausted. So as long as the forests are harvested sustainably, you shouldn't worry about what's the potential of wood. There's also technical potential in superfaces, in reshaping, in reusing it. As an example, that was a project together with ETH. So we used the mechanical or the theoretical method of bilayer metal. So the different fiber directions and the different humidities and the different dimensions of the board went automatically into the geometry to build those panels and also to erect them afterwards on construction site. So the potential is far to be exhausted. Second statement, whenever you think about carbon, it's not only that it's not enough that the trees are growing into the forest or you plant trees, because after 50 years, there's going to be a sink. So if you really want to talk about the topic of carbon, then you have to prolong or to store the carbon into timber constructions. That's the real sustainable way of removing timber from the atmosphere. My third statement is that as Marlise just told, there are also hybrid materials to be searched. It's not only to use timber, but maybe to use it in a combination of different materials, different forms, different applications, as long as they are homogeneous and after the life cycle, then they can be burned. My fourth statement is that we all, and you as architects as well, we have to fulfill customer needs. And the customer needs show today that also timber constructions are asked to be more and more perfect sculptures, and to really act to a sustainable forest management. That means maybe we have to switch or to change our view of timber. Maybe the beauty is that it's not a perfect material. Maybe the beauty that is that not one board can be the same. So this is also something we should talk about. The fifth statement is that timber constructions today, they're not only sustainable, they are also high-tech. And high-tech in terms of how we plan this building, but also how we bring the data to the execution process. And this will also create new market in building industry for timber, because it's very easy to prefabricate. And if you see the picture here, that's one of our most appreciated carpenters. It's still the same person, it's still the same man, but that's the tool he uses today in the factory. And talking about tomorrow is also that not only technologies are changing, but roles of architects, clients, and also the responsibility for architects to react on the climate change is one of the challenges we face. What's also needed, and it was always needed in building industry, but today working in collaboration and working within the companies, but also around the borders of the company, without trust, you can't work digitally. You work very transparent, you work very open. There are new methods, new tools, new roles, and also changes in planning and building processes. In a standardized construction, that's probably the way standard constructions are built, not only because the most sophisticated way of prefabrication, it's also because it's not very nice if I say that, but you don't need 30% of planning costs, because the client buys the constructions. He's not really planning them and engineering them. He orders them. And the factory approach as you can see it here in Gosau. And the same processes, and because they can't be done without IT supported planning. So this is the way we do freeforms, the same processes, like for example, the mosque in Cambridge, most or often with a mock-up, and to see what's the design like, the first draft of the architect, the interpretation, and also the bringing up of the information to construction. It means master surfaces, applying patterns to the master surface, investigating volumes, and then investigated beams and joints, and then seeing how they connect. And at the end, you have got 145 different variations and different beams. You produce them out of different volumes, and then you bring up the design to reality with milling, with erection, and at the end you've got those kind of buildings. That's freeforms. For us, very nice because we can show that timber has got a new, or we can show timber in a different way. Sixth statement: collaborations are based on trust. You can see that if architects come to our company in Gosau, but what we need is education, is research, and also good skilled craftsmen. Statement 7: there will be new transparency to clients. I've chosen a model here by Mobic Auto Construction. So you can order your building, the client designs their buildings, and the robots are going to produce them. New distribution channels, but also new roles of the value chain. And the statement 8 is: building with wood is not a trend, it's part of a sustainable development. And for you as architects, it matters not only what you build, but also how you build. And this is the future of timber also in dense circumstances or cities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katharina. That was great. Really great. And then finally, Summer and Paloma.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself first. 1 second. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So I'm Paloma. I established Material Cultures with Summer in 2019. Our presentation is probably around 10 minutes, so closer to the 10 than the 5, just to warn you. What we do ties in quite nicely to what Katharina was talking about just now. Material Cultures is a not-for-profit research organisation, and we're working at the intersection of low embodied carbon design, digital technology, and mass production. We established Material Cultures in order to respond to the growing...
Paloma, we're able to hear you. Somehow it's a bit garbled. I'm not sure why, though, obviously.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. We established Material Cultures in order to respond to the growing need for materials and building systems which are low carbon, affordable, and sustainable. And before we talk about what we do, I'm just going to talk quickly about materials and stuff. So for many millennia and in many parts of the world today, we made buildings out of stuff. Stone from the ground, such as this limestone, wood from the forests. And in many contexts, this stuff didn't move very far from where it originated. And extraordinary kind of technological systems such as this, these are kind of 10-story high terrace towers in Yemen that were almost kind of extruded out of the ground. And buildings made almost entirely of straw. And these sod houses in Iceland, which are made of kind of earth. They're insulated and clad out of the material by which they're surrounded. In the kind of contemporary context, we're working with a product architecture, and you have this kind of layering of construction, so you can almost read the kind of libelous kind of culture that we exist in, as well as the kind of layers of building regulation in the kind of makeup of a wall. So now you'll have at least 8 materials that an average wall build up. Each of those materials has a different role. And sustainability has really only been thought about, or predominantly only been thought about in terms of energy in use until quite recently. So a passive house, for example, is understood to be highly insulated, super airtight, heat recovered ventilation, no thermal bridges, triple glazed, all of these brilliant things which are achieved by materials like this. This is kind of butyl tape, we've got nylon thermal resistors, we've got PVC membranes and polyurethane foams. And these are the products which have for a long time helped us achieve our thermal performance. They're also all petrochemical based, and I think to a large extent you could describe our contemporary material culture as one of petrol, in that it's allowed us to ship things very cheaply around the world and generated products like these. So there's a number of consequences, we think, from this mode of construction. One is waste. So we're producing extraordinary amounts of waste because these materials are very difficult to reuse and recycle, and they can't go back into the ground without causing kind of toxic problems. Another one is the amount of carbon that's being produced. And then this issue, which is maybe less talked about, which is the toxic qualities of these materials. So from carpets to MDF, the materials, some of the materials that we're bringing into our homes, off gas, and those gases in some instances make the inside of our homes more unhealthy than the kind of outside and the fumes created by cars. Another consequence is a loss of agency. So we are increasingly kind of alienated from how our homes work because they are performing a bit more like machines than they are buildings. And then maybe more existential, but the kind of consequence of these spaces and how they're acting on us, how they make us feel, and that sense of being quite a few layers away from the kind of building. So material cultures is asking this question, is can we kind of return to stuff, or at least some of the ideas that with which we used to think about architecture?
Hello. And so we developed a set of principles by which our work can begin to address the issues we see in the construction industry today. We begin with inherited knowledge, looking back before we look forward. Our building systems combine contemporary technologies with traditional knowledge, and we draw from techniques and materials that have been proven through centuries of testing and use. Next slide, please. Is an important element of our work is considering the impact of what we do socially as well as physically, which is why we're committed to developing supply chains locally with the construction materials we use. We consult with our clients and local supply chain partners to ensure local value systems are created in the places in which we work. Working with nature reflects our circular economy principles, where the systems we design use natural materials that reintegrate with the ecosystem at the end of their life, which effectively means that they decay and become compost, and as they're sourced from the land, they're inherently low carbon and low impact. And it's important to us that these principles are effective at scale, which is why efficiency and performance is crucial to the design and implementation of our systems. So off-site manufacturing and end-to-end building information modeling allows us to improve our efficiency, minimize waste, and improve the working conditions on site. And the buildings are designed to last and to long outlive the average new build home without compromising on the quality of the environments we create. So we work carefully with our construction partners to ensure build quality and material provenance, making homes which are robust. And a necessary and important shift in the material cultures we exist within today is towards empowerment. So as Paloma said, to ensure the buildings we live in can be passed on to the generations to come, we need to understand how they're assembled and how they can be maintained and cared for to prolong their life, so that we have agency in that. And so we provide user manuals to our buildings, which supports and empowers our clients to improve and adapt them over time. So material cultures, as material cultures, we conduct research into the way our built environment can be low carbon and low impact and low cost. And our sister company, Material Construction, is through which we work with industry partners to implement this knowledge. So we work with engineering firm Arup to develop our systems and track the embodied carbon and circular principles of our work. And we work with industry partners like the brick manufacturers H.G. Matthews, whose factory is shown in this image, where we have our own prototyping and testing workshops. And we also work with academic partners like the UAL and UCL, where we teach and collaborate with students to develop our ideas, where learning is conducted through making and building, and our design and build projects explore particular details, like this house, which is the drawing which is shown there, is designed with our students to look at a hempcrete SIP with residential U values. And that was designed with 30 MArch students working together to form an entire design and contracting team. This project was a timber construction exploring the use of acetylated timber foundations going directly into the ground. And this is an outdoor classroom we developed for Grisdale Art Centre, built at a workshop we led with Takeshi Hayatsu, which was designed without concrete footings, using a dry stone walling plinth and rocks from the riverbed weighing down the roof, and boulders from a nearby quarry to resist uplift on the eaves. We collaborate on these projects with engineers and consultants like Pete from Structure Workshop, and this forms an important part of the learning we do with the group, learning through our hands, through testing, and through drawing.
My boiler's broken, so I've got a plumber around in the background who you can probably hear now, having a chat about this heating. So hopefully I can talk over that. So yeah, part of that is developing prototypes such as this. We also developed a full-scale building called Flat House, which is a house made from prefabricated cassettes. So the cassettes were made off-site and filled with a mixture of hemp and lime, otherwise known as hempcrete. They were brought to site and assembled or lifted into place with a crane, which took about 2 days, and then overclad. So the hempcrete here provides insulation, but also provides kind of wall mass and thermal mass for the building. And importantly for us, I think it's breathable. I might just tell them to shush 1 second. Hello, back. We also worked with Margent Farm, who are the tenants of the building, to develop a cladding system. So this is the fibre of the plant. So it's kind of stripped from the outside of the stalk, mixed with a sugar resin, which is kind of made from the starches from agricultural waste, and then compressed into a corrugated sheet. So it's kind of resembles other kind of agricultural building products, but it's entirely natural and biodegradable. The house, as you can see, is very kind of structurally exposed. We were interested in it being very legible and you being able to kind of really read and understand how it was constructed. It would be equally possible to render the whole thing and it look very kind of conventional and clean lined. The house has been demonstrated to perform incredibly well both in terms of in-use carbon and embodied carbon. So it actually sequesters 5 tons of carbon. If you, sorry, I'm getting distracted. Sequesters 5 tons of carbon if you include the carbon that's sequestered by the timber. And it, Ollie, I'm in the middle of my talk. And in terms of in-use carbon, it kind of outpasses carbon zero by a factor of 2. So it's performing really well. It's a family home. It's being used. It's inhabited. It's 2.5 bedrooms with a mezzanine. And a kind of variety of spatial types. So this kind of attic room, and then this double height kitchen. And it was built incredibly cheaply. considering the kind of volumes of the spaces. So we've been working with our students at UCL to look at what this means at a different scale. So scaling up from kind of one-off singular home to kind of stacked flats and maisonettes, and thinking about the same kind of logic and structural principles, but applied over a number of stories. This is a proposal developed by Evelyn Salt. And then tower type. So this is Maria El Salvador, who's been looking at towers, and then thinking about urban propositions and how these proposals can be integrated into an urban context.
And very quickly, I'll talk a little bit about the research we do as well. So this is some of the critical research we'd conducted this year with our students at CSM, which is looking at an analysis of the RIBA plan of work, basically, where our students started to propose alternative stages and amendments to these kind of institutional frameworks. For example, what it would mean, sorry, Paloma, next slide, to explore the impact of early integration of BIM into a project on the risk and cost of that project. Next slide, please, madam. Paloma. I need to skip some slides for me. Yeah, thank you. And the impact, next slide, of what it would mean to start a project rather than end it with its material specification, so that you'd be led by the embodied carbon of materials that you work with, rather than have that as a kind of afterthought. And then we looked with our students at what it would mean, you can go on to the next, what critical regionalism would mean in the 21st century in the context of the climate crisis. So looking at the language of housing and what that language would be if we were able to build radically low carbon, regionally specific housing models, and how each of these would respond to the regional, social and economic context in which they were situated. So looking, for example, at the industries which exist in a place, what the kind of forestry landscape is and what the geology of that place might be. And then from what those prevalent industries were, looking the kind of economic and social makeup of a place and how you draw all of those different strands of context together into a kind of housing model, and what that housing model might be made of, and how all of that research, which becomes very inherent to our process of design, leads to the development of regionally responsive housing types, which might offer an alternative to the status quo. Thank you very much. That is us. Sorry, it's a bit long.
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. We're going to start with some questions from a group of the students here. You should think about if you want to address the question to all of the speakers or to one speaker, either is possible, but I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentations. It was very interesting. And so we prepared a few questions that now you have answered already by some part. But to the question of sustainability, you explained how you address this problem. And we were wondering by which means can you bring the biggest change for a more sustainable CO2 neutral surrounding? Is it by focusing on urban mining, recycling, innovation of new types of construction? Or do we have already all the tools, but is it just too expensive? Is the demand not high enough because people are afraid of let's say, construction types that they don't know? Or is the construction branch just too slow to keep up with the new innovations? And this question is addressed to all of you. Yeah.
I mean, if I could just, perhaps Marlise could start by answering the question. And it was really about where in one's practice the maximum effect could be in terms of dealing with this problem of CO2 emissions and more generally in being sustainable. And what would be interesting to hear from Marlise, partially because her presentation was very short, but also because your business is concrete. And I think what so impresses me about how you run your company is how attentive you've been to the problems that concrete and cement use have in terms of carbon emissions. So perhaps you could talk about a few examples in what's happening in your company now about how you're addressing this issue.
For my company, it is we are a very small company, only 25 employers, and so we don't have a short. We have only when we decide us for make some new products, then we have to do it in the normal time, and it is very difficult to see what brings the future for us. And so it's, I think at the moment, it is the question is about the ecological, I think recycling material to use and to save the environment. And so for me, I think it is the real way to go in the recycling material, but it is not so easy because we have norms that we have to fulfill, and we have to earn money the whole day, and when you have time to explore other things, then it needs time. But I think the architects and the builders, they are interested for new material, and so we are in this research.
Thank you. And Katharina, could I ask you, I mean, it was 3 or 4 years ago, the regulations were changed in Switzerland, and especially in terms of fire regulations. And could you talk about, were companies like yours behind those changes? Because you've obviously benefited from those changes.
Actually, the success was that it was not a company, it was the Lignum, that's an association, which made a concept of testing, of dialogue with all these authorities, because in Switzerland, in 26 cantons, it burns differently. So it was like taking the responsibility to change the regulations, but also to secure quality control, because it's not done if you say you can build like this, that you also have to take care that all the execution and details are according to the new regulations. And that opened, actually, I mean, the regulations were changed in 2002 or 3 the first time, and again about 3 or 4 years ago. And this just opens new markets and new possibilities and new creativity, but it's still sometimes hard to convince the authorities that it's not like 200 years ago when cities burned down. It's a new way of looking at things.
Yes, I totally agree with that. But of course, with the change of the regulations, you know, in Switzerland now, there's a number of towers of 60 or 80 meters that are being planned in timber. And then the same question, but with a slight change to Paloma and to Summer. I mean, I think it's really fantastic what you're doing, but within the context of Switzerland, you know, the battles that you have to fight to convince people of what you're doing are really considerable, because a lot of the arguments that you're making, and you know, I think that the house that you showed, it's obviously it was a very special client and a very kind of, you created a very constructive setting to make that project. But I think in Switzerland, some of the things, at least that are in that project, are almost required by law. And I'm just wondering how much you look outside the UK context in terms of where you want your practice to go, or in terms of advocating, you know, the techniques and the sensibilities that that you embody in your work.
I think we're definitely starting within a UK context. We're going to tackle one thing at a time. So our intention is to develop a model which works in the UK context and which can be built cheaply and performs to the UK building regulations, and then try and get that out there and make a success of that. And then from there start to develop up in scale and in breadth and, you know, a bit more globally. But I think we're very aware that the kind of problem is big, and the barriers, there's a lot of kind of barriers there. And I think we are very much taking one step at a time. But I think this problem is something that's going to need to be addressed in so many ways by so many different parties, and hopefully in with quite a kind of coordinated approach, something will happen. But at the bottom, the kind of bottom line, I think, is that there's going to need to be regulatory changes in order for these materials to be taken up fully. Regulation around embodied carbon in construction, and yeah, that's what we'll see, the kind of final shift into a kind of better material culture, and that will probably happen differently in different countries across the world.
As you said, Adam, it's quite different in mainland Europe, and one of the issues that we found is that a lot of the materials we'd like to specify or we'd like to be working with are coming from Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and they're not available in the UK. And so kind of we're in a place where some of our principles are in conflict with each other. We're not able to find those materials here, and they're also not being manufactured here because it's not economically viable. So we're kind of a step behind the UK's supply industry, and it may be that regulation steps in to make those materials more affordable to manufacture, and then they can have broader impact than they're having at the moment.
Yeah, I guess that's the point I'm making, is that with legislation, you can overnight make something economically feasible because it's the thing that you have to do. For instance, what they've done in France with timber construction, there was none. The city of Paris said that 50% of the construction had to be with timber construction, and overnight it was affordable because you didn't have a choice. Next question.
So our next question is maybe more general for everyone, but in which direction should our forms of living develop, and how can your businesses, philosophy support this thesis? So how can the materials we use inform us on a new form of living? We guess the way, like the normal type of living now, does it also have to change depending on the materials we use? So maybe we mean housing, but could also inform other programs.
You heard that. Maybe Summer and Paloma, you want to start. I mean, it's a bit that we've been talking, all three presentations were about the transformation of the techniques that are used to build the buildings that we customarily have been building since the post-Second World War period. And actually, do we need to be thinking about different kinds of buildings, or maybe not building also? Do you have a view on that? Maybe Summer and Paloma, you could start.
It's one of the questions that we talked a lot about with our students this year, actually, at CSM. I think the kind of an interrogation to the plan of work for the RIBA, a lot of the responses our students had was that we ought to start with the question of whether or not we should be building at all. and in terms of housing, well, building supply and existing building stock, where we actually have an awful lot of buildings, certainly in the UK, that are utilised in maybe inefficient ways. And so there's a kind of a question before you start any project, I suppose. But again, that feeds into a conversation about regulatory frameworks facilitating a kind of reuse and a reutilising existing stock in a kind of efficient way. And then the question of, I guess we've been talking a lot about housing and material cultures. It's our primary focus, and that's because of the sort of high unmet demand for housing that exists in the United Kingdom. And I suppose at the moment we think about that in existing housing models because that is what there is a demand for. But equally, there's plenty of opportunity for us to develop alternative models for housing which accommodate different forms of living, I suppose, which is what you're getting at, different ways in which we live together in a community. And I think there's lots of potential for that. I wouldn't say it's specific to the material palette that we look at, but I think it's important for a kind of a future of building where we make better use of the buildings that we make.
One of the other conversations that we were having through the year
Is
around cultures of care, and that one of the shifts that might happen or need to happen is a return, I guess, to the idea that a building isn't something that you kind of make and then throw away. You know, we've kind of ended up with a product kind of culture around buildings in the same way as we do around some of the other things that we buy, and we use them to the end of their life, then we kind of get a new one or replace a bit. But yeah, so returning to the idea of mending things, caring for things, and I think that keys into this idea of the building manual, that by giving people the kind of tools with which they can be in control of their environments and understand what that bit of wood's doing and what, you know, the roles that the different components play, then they can be much more proactive in maintaining those and doing that without huge expense.
Yeah. Katharina, you mentioned in your presentation, and it's obviously, the logic is irrefutable, that it's not only by using timber that one is, or by growing trees that one is capturing carbon, that actually if one wants to continue to capture carbon, one needs to build with the trees and plant new trees. And I was wondering how, but on the other hand, it's clear that if we just build more and more new buildings, even if they're made in timber, you know, we are using energy somehow, even though we're using less if we're building in timber. How does a powerful company like yours address the kind of issue that maybe in the last 10, 15 years in Switzerland, for instance, there's been too much construction? What is your attitude about that?
I mean, I think we should differentiate in between Switzerland and other areas of the world, because talking about sustainability, there is another topic in other areas. I strongly believe that in Switzerland, talking about the future building industry, it's going to be dense. I don't believe the concept of tiny houses, because that's consuming too much land. So it's going to be dense, it's going to be high, but it's also, from an architectural point of view, creates new rooms, because these houses have to be, they're made for human beings, maybe staying at home during 3 months, 24 hours, because they're doing home offices. That means that the balcony plays another role. The apartments have to be healthy, and the room shouldn't consume any energy during the people live in. That's one topic. That's my answer to how does an apartment look like in the future. And in other areas of the world, we have got the topic that more and more people are moving to the city. There is a huge pressure to build for these people. And in my opinion, the question of no housing is just insane. Seeing all these homeless don't have any rooms, and not having the not having the social stability. You know, the people living in the favela, they have first to move somewhere to have a home. And that's the other responsibility, how to fulfill that need in sustainable material. That's the other part of the coin, which is also a task of the architects to provide solutions, because this is energy and carbon consuming more than it is in Switzerland.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm not sure though, like, of course, it's more efficient to live in a denser way, and one cannot support, you know, building single family houses anywhere. But I wonder if the requirement for density hasn't been overstated because of, you know, that developers want to build a lot. That's another reason, that's another thing that's really pushed building bigger and bigger and denser and denser. And Marlise, I mean, in the context, clearly it's right what you said. Your company, in a way, it's a kind of almost a boutique precast company, and I guess that's why we've in our office worked with you quite a lot, because you're very responsive and you're always developing new ways of doing things. And now what you were talking about was working with more and more recycled materials, so that we're not excavating virgin stone for aggregate, and also using a minimum of cement. But this idea of new ways of living or needing new kinds of buildings, like how do you see a smaller company like your own engaging with kind of more strategic questions like that?
I'm not understand what the question is.
Well, just as you're like, I can see how you're developing the products that you make in your company to have less carbon, to take better advantage of recycling, using recycled materials that have already been used. But yeah, like where do you like strategically feel about, like, when there's a project to overclad, to make a new facade on an existing building, at what point could you just repair the existing building? Like, when is a project, you know, how much resources should we be using, you know, in 5 or 10 years when we're talking about making building projects? I mean, it's not your responsibility in a way, but you must have an opinion about that.
I can only speak what I think in Switzerland, and I think in the last few years we built a lot of new buildings and homes, and the place that we have is very small, and so I think in the next years it would be more that the old buildings will be renovating, and so probably we need not a new whole house or buildings on the only a part for a new house, because we have not enough capacity for the land. And I think what I can see, it's less, the start with new building is less than in the last in the last 2 years. And I think also the question about the new home is how is it called? It's not interested for other peoples, and I think it's more renovation. The start will go to more renovation in Switzerland, and I'm still only my customers are only in Switzerland, so we go in this direction. And the how many rooms, and so that it's not in my decision. I only have to build then whatever a new facade or only new walls. And I think we don't start with new so many new buildings in the next years.
I agree. And I also think that the fact that you're not such a big company means that you're very flexible, aren't you? That you'll be able to respond more easily than a big company to do things that are very specific to an existing project. I could imagine that. That would be something that your company in particular would be very good at doing because you're so responsive.
I think that is, yeah, because I'm a small company, and so I'm more flexible than a bigger company for where when the market is changing. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, sorry. So I have a question about craftsmanship, because it's craftsmanship is gradually replaced by technology, yet it's still a part of your companies at the moment. How are you compensating for the hours that are put into handwork, research, and individualization? Would you say that your product is thereby becoming a luxury product, and can it still become affordable for the big mass? Maybe we start with Katharina.
Okay, so I'm sorry, but at the moment we don't replace our appreciated craftsmen. We are just having more office hours to prepare the work so they can run their machines. So that's at the moment the status of digitalization. But of course, our vision is that changes as a whole process, but that needs sophisticated planning as well as more and more tools to do that. And at the end, we don't want to replace our craftsmen, but we use them for more sophisticated work than only just doing automatically nailing of an element, because they are so precious that we just need them for more sophisticated work. But craftsmen, I mean, if I would recommend my daughter or my son to take a good decision for the future, I would really decide to go into craftsmanship.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, maybe we should just, asking the question, what were you thinking? Because I totally agree that with new technologies, one isn't, of course, some technologies, when we're talking about really mega scales that are often at the scale bigger than making buildings, it is only about profits. It's about reducing things so that the few people you have are so unskilled, it's like Amazon kind of. But if one thinks of like the high, and it's not about that it's expensive, but really sophisticated building technique. And Switzerland is really one of the best places in the world for that. I think that all of these new techniques aren't about replacing humans. They're about expanding the capacity of humans. Also, of course, recognizing that you have to pay humans more than you did 100 years ago, and therefore you need to be more strategic about what they're doing. But I think that these machines, for instance, in timber construction, they're incredibly empowering, and the human is the person who's programming, but also the person who's operating, and it's still this incredible partnership between people and technique, isn't it? But by asking the question, were you thinking that it wasn't the case, or?
I was just wondering about, because when you actually don't use the technology so much, all the work hours getting more and more expensive, and you cannot compete, or you cannot go with the big firms which actually produce those products for a much cheaper price. So the question was, is it then when you actually still rely on on craftsmanship, that it's actually getting a luxury product and it's not like affordable for everyone, and it cannot be that, I don't know, with wood construction, it cannot be that big material for the future.
Maybe I can give an answer to that. So I hate this discussion because it means that something individual or something which needs sophisticated handcraft is always more expensive. And sometimes architects play a crucial role to come to this result. So individual planning doesn't mean per se that it's more expensive, but you can't, building industry is the less or the worse sophisticated industry in terms of productivity, industrialization, automatization. And you can't fight against the market. And you see that in kitchens, you see that in windows. 40 years ago, a window was made by a small carpentry. And today, this is the products you also buy from industrialized company. So this is just the way it goes. But it still needs innovation, and it still needs craftsmen, and it still needs interaction in between machines and people. And without people, you're not developing either innovation nor new processes. But I wouldn't say one is better and one is worse. It's another segmentation of the market, and you're going to fulfill your needs or your wishes in whatever technology.
I totally agree. But in Switzerland, somehow there's more of a balance because craftspeople are more valued, they're better paid. So, you showed the Cambridge Mosque where, they needed a Swiss Holzbau company to make the structure. And we're now working on a timber structure building in Cambridge also. And I know that I'll probably come and talk to you about it in 6 months' time when we're ready to start thinking about the construction. In Britain, because so much of construction is just driven, there's plenty of craftsman skill in Britain. You can still build anything. But in Britain, it's become much more a luxury thing because the normal construction has so much to do with quite bad companies making a lot of money. And that isn't the case in Switzerland. In Switzerland, there's different values. The idea of craftsmanship is just more culturally and politically important.
And also the social status of our craftsmen.
Much higher, and the whole education, exactly. I mean, that was over 100 years ago in Britain. There were a number of decisions which made it very, very different, the history there. Maybe Paloma and Summer, it would be interesting with you developing your materials, but also the house project that you showed, you talked a bit about where you're finding the materials, but where are you finding the partners in terms of making, for instance, the corrugated cladding material, the different uses of the hemp, the timber cassettes, which were quite basic. So I don't know if they were made in Britain, or did they mention, or did they have to be, because Summer, you were mentioning how a lot of things still have to be brought from, say, Germany. Do you want to talk about that? And, it's sort of the small p political implications of how you build,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is something that we're really interested in, and I think we concur with a lot of what Katharina described in terms of that relationship between the kind of machine and the maker. And one of the ways that we're continuing, I think, to really value, there's so much value in the act of making and putting something together, and there's so much learning that happens from doing that in a very direct and haptic way, and that's why that is at the core of our education practice and research practice, is always going to be to return to a direct relationship with making, because there's a kind of invention that happens in that mode that maybe isn't possible when you're in the machine mode, but then you can get the machines to help you do that again and again and again. As Katharina said, you know, it's a waste of someone's energy and mental capacity to stand there putting the same nails into the same bit of wood. So with the projects that we have done, they've been kind of formed and generated out of relationships, I guess, that we've developed over time with people that are working in a similar way in a similar field. So from kind of builders to material specialists, and a lot of that context that exists now it's all kind of happening on a very small scale. There aren't very many organizations thinking or working in that way, so they're quite easy to find, and everyone's quite interested in kind of collaboration. So the teams for those projects have been small, and they've been a lot of kind of sole traders often, but then scaling up actually to places like the factory, which is a family-run business, H.G. Matthews, where they make bricks in the same way that they have for 100 years, but they've also realized that they can do quite a lot of other things with those same materials. So if you take lime, straw, clay, and some flint, and you know, change the scale of the grain of the components, whether it be kind of silt, sand, clay, and the recipes through which you put them together, that you can produce all kinds of things, from kind of insulation to renders to actually kind of foundations. So we're working in a niche little corner of the world for the moment, and working with people that are interested in the same ideas, but we do feel like these things can scale, and they can scale quite quickly. These materials are readily available and very easy to grow. So as soon as the market is there for them, I am very confident, we're very confident that it will be responded to. It's just creating the conditions where that's going to happen.
And then the regulatory frameworks which support that, because you mentioned the cladding, Adam, which Paloma talked about in the presentation. Mm-hmm. That's a bit of that's like a very good example, I suppose, of what we're talking about now, where a material which is developed and is very sustainable and makes lots of sense to be available in the market, we couldn't get it. Well, Paloma, maybe you should talk more about this bit, because it was developed through Margent Farm, but this process of being certified and becoming available as a product and having the kind of necessary guarantees and warranties around it was something that was kind of insurmountable at the scale at which we work at the moment. Is that right? Was it fire testing, Paloma? It didn't get through.
The regulatory stuff's been fine. So yeah, it's just been very difficult getting a new product to market, just in terms of the kind of more the infrastructure to make that happen, and then the issues of kind of scale and cost. So yeah, how to make it affordable when at least in the offset you're going to be producing it in relatively small quantities. But again, I think it's just one of those things about scale of manufacturing and being able to compete. It comes back to the question.
Okay, thanks. And Marlise, it would be really interesting, because in the British context, precasting is a kind of incredibly rough industry. But of course, I visited precasters in Switzerland or in Flanders, for instance, where it's a much more kind of clean and precise industry. And just in this context of craftsmanship and technique, and the fact that you're developing the ways in which you're making your elements very quickly, actually. Could you just tell us a little bit about the skills that the people who work for your company have, and the way that those skills have had to develop in order to go, for instance, from a you know, steel reinforced to a fiber reinforced concrete, and then beyond to the sorts of materials that you're developing now. That would be really interesting, given you have 25 people, not hundreds and hundreds of people. So they must be highly skilled, but also quite flexible.
Yeah, and that's our strength, that we are very small and flexible. And our elements are for 80% handmade. We don't have a machine for make our elements. It's only to make the concrete. It is a machine, and all other work is handmade. And for us, is it a strange because we are flexible, but we need employers, makers with a good skills, and they have to be interested, and they have to be very flexible and open for news. I mean, for news elements and for news material, and every work we have, every build we make is a new one, and we have short, but we have to explore the new steps to be a little bit economical. That the element, it's still the same. Maybe the elements, sometimes they are more difficult in forms and arts, and for us it is a challenge to find new partners. I think Katharina is a partner sometimes for us to make our forms for the concrete elements, because we need the form in wood or in steel, and so we need other partners they have as well and interested in use. And yeah, I think for us and still the market in Switzerland, it is so, the architects in Switzerland, they won't build a house with 100 similar elements. It have to be different. It's in Germany, or in Germany, it's not the same building. They build more similar houses than here in Switzerland. Normally you don't see another similar house in Switzerland. And yeah, for us it is a challenge, but it is interesting to work with. So yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was, yeah, I mean, also this idea of partnerships and collaborations with other companies, that's also, it's very contemporary, it feels, but it's like that's the ancient way of doing things also. It's really nice that those partnerships persist. Do you have one more question?
Okay, so our last question is that it's really refreshing for us to see that all your companies are led by women, by you. And so what's your experience in this man-dominated branch? And what is also your innovation to change the classical and rather conservative business model? I don't really know. I mean, who's up for it? I guess everyone can answer this question.
Marlise, maybe first. You were just speaking, so being and really, it happened kind of. It just sort of happened. The fact that we had women on this panel, but it was something that we enjoyed for exactly the reasons you're saying. And I mean, Marlise, how have you found? Like, what is distinctive about being a woman running a construction company? And frankly, Switzerland, my experience of Switzerland is not that things are more open to women actually than in other countries. And I guess the other thing is what innovations come from having a woman-led company.
I don't know, come another innovation from a woman than a man. I think it's down to be, if you are owner and you will, how is it called, over life, I don't know, in the market, then you have to be innovation, and you have to be a little bit looking in an crystal to see how brings the future. And I think it's not depend from a man, not from a woman who make this job. It's only the position makes it.
It's fair enough. And Katharina, do you want to add something to that?
I mean, I can only share my experience. So I think 24 years ago, that's the time I'm doing my job. It was a bit uneasy, you know. It's like it wasn't common, and there were only meetings, like it was said, Frau Lehmann, geschätzte Herren, because there were only men. And so I was. It was a bit like everybody's watching me because they know my name. But today, it doesn't make any difference. And generally said, but it's only a very, very, very general and holistic or general message. But I think women, they tend to have a more holistic or general way of looking at things. And they're able to combine different disciplines and also maybe to look at things a bit more deeply. But I know that's completely general, but that's a quality of the woman, to combine things and maybe also to develop more sustainable ways of doing it, because they think it in tendency more to the end. Just generally.
I think the room here agrees with that. That's.
I couldn't see that, because I thought that now you're just, you know, what the hell is she saying? So
I think it's right. I think it's right. And Summer and Paloma?
Is the question, what's it like to be a woman in the construction industry?
In the construction industry.
Well, I suppose Paloma's and our experience mostly is of being women in architecture. And I think a lot of one of the things that's been driving material cultures and material construction is that we look to kind of diversify in the industry in lots of different ways. And I think it's something that we're excited and engaged to be part of, but we find often that we are a minority. But that's also true of my experience of being an architect in lots of different contexts. And I think it's changing. Maybe Paloma has something more insightful to say, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. The construction industry, it's kind of terrifyingly masculine, I guess, in its disposition. And that may be partly why we've ended up working in the kind of corner of it that we have, is in that it's slightly insulated from the most kind of fervent masculine qualities, because it's smaller and more driven. The people that seem to be currently in the kind of highly sustainable, natural, low-embodied carbon materials seem to have a kind of gentle-ish disposition and a passion for what they're doing and why they're doing it, beyond kind of a kind of profit motivation. Not to say that that's a masculine trait, but it means that some of those kind of ways of working with each other can be overcome. And I think, as Summer said, I mean, it's almost, I've always been very involved in the construction of the buildings that I've kind of designed. And for the first large part of my career, I was the person on site building those buildings. And I know a lot about construction, and it is interesting that that's still something that I kind of experience a bit of kind of consternation around, or you can see that people are surprised that you know your kind of nuts and bolts, which is a sad thing in this time. But I think it's part of the reason that we're driven just to change that, having experienced it, and wanting to continue to kind of challenge those perceptions of gender.
Thanks a lot. I think since we're almost out of time, that's a really great place to end. I'd like to thank our speakers. It was really great. We've had some technical problems on our side, but I think you haven't on yours, so that's good. So I'd really like to thank Marlise Blaser, Katharina Lehmann, Summer Islam, and Paloma Gormley. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your time with us. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.